Here's a quick look into today's episode.
I would just break that down to two major buckets as kind of like what I've learned and how, and by the way, I don't know everything. I sure know a lot of what not to do, not necessarily what to do. I'll share some thoughts on kind of that background and how that's a more resilient leader and a more resilient entrepreneur. And then, how we take some of these business finance concepts and apply them to Stop Soldier Suicide, which is a nonprofit that's run like a for-profit business as a way to more effectively deliver the services that we provide. So,
welcome to another episode of Teach Me to Fish, where our purpose is to help leaders better understand what drives people. In today's world, the core of recruiting and retaining talent revolves around leadership, and not just average leadership, but motivated, values-based, inspirational leadership. Our pursuit is to get a little bit better every day. Progress equals small victories and stacking habits. Habits like getting up early, working your butt off, learning something new, being positive, and surrounding yourself with phenomenal people. Today's episode is with Brian Kinsella. It won't take long to realize why I'm so excited to share this conversation with you. Brian's superpower is his ability to immediately gain people's trust. He does this using a range of experiences and skills he developed growing up in a modest family, learning to lead at Johns Hopkins ROTC right after 9/11, deploying multiple times and being stationed overseas. He'll share his personal struggles transitioning from the Army to Wall Street and getting into the financial and entrepreneurship world. Here's where Brian and some of his closest friends took a leap of faith to make a difference, helping veterans and anyone who believes in service with their mental health. Their audacious goal is ultimately to reduce service member and veteran suicide by 40% by the end of the decade. It's no surprise when it's time to put together a special team to help with a challenge that is ill-defined, complex, and requires extreme discipline and creativity, that Brian is the guy that people trust. I hope you enjoy today's conversation with Brian Kinsella. Yeah.
That's great, man.
Yeah, thank you, man. I appreciate it. You always do that. You use all my tactics against me, and as soon as we get into a conversation that's supposed to be about you and it's supposed to be about these things, that's what you do. You turn it back on me and you get me talking about me for 15 minutes. We've been talking for 23 minutes now, and you keep getting me talking about how good my life is, and let's get to the whole point of this. And, and Brian, we met a while ago. We met at Rick Turner's Change of Command, talking about when two people meet, you instantly know that's a good person. One, because they're being vouched for by people I care about and people that I know and their values. But like we instantly in the car that day, me, you, and Christy driving out to Rick's Change of Command, I knew that we would have a relationship for a long time. I always knew we would be doing this. I knew we would be recording it. This episode will not do justice for all the things that we've already talked about before and will do going into the future. To kick it off, I'd love for you to kind of tell us a little bit about who you are, what you're working on right now, and a little bit of like a little spoiler alert.
Sure. And it was great to meet and spend that time. And Derek Knoll, also another great guy, great friend, excited for his next chapter too, because he was in that car with us. He was our driver.
Yeah, that's right.
A little bit about my background, product of New Jersey, which we like to call the Texas of the North, where I'm from. A lot of us were directly affected by 9/11. We knew the school of people who lost parents in the World Trade Center when that came down. And I was actually a police explorer at the time in New Jersey, an EMT. It was one of those things where it really hit home. And I was in the process of figuring out where I was going to go to college, was in the process of committing to Johns Hopkins, where I was going to be on their wrestling team. And for me, I've always been kind of oriented towards service. And like many people, 9/11 was a call to service, that intrinsic motivation, and signed an ROTC contract, not a scholarship cadet out of the gate, and signed on that dotted line as an 18-year-old, knowing full well that we were about to be a nation at war, and that's something that I felt strongly about participating in. My time on active duty after earning a commission from Hopkins had me in 5 countries in 5 years. Spent some time in Germany and Italy. A lot of that was a lot of train up, out in Eastern Germany, preparing for first Iraq deployment. Had the opportunity to command and lead a detachment of soldiers that was out of both Italy and Germany. Did 15 months in central Baghdad during the surge. That was a really great opportunity. I loved being able to not just lead, but really be with soldiers. And I love that concept of, it really was beaten to my brain from the NCOs I had at Hopkins. Master Sergeant Matt Eversman was one of my mentors, still is one of my mentors. He was our senior non-commissioned officer at Hopkins ROTC. Another guy, Sergeant Derek Beatty, he was a 2nd Ranger Battalion NCO. Those guys really talked a lot about the concepts of leadership, leading from the front, and how much and how important that would be for this kind of next generation of officers who were commissioning post 9/11. I was also in Haiti right after the earthquake. We deployed with the Global Reaction Force under 18th Airborne Corps and 82nd. Some of the first Americans on the ground in Haiti right after the 2010 earthquake. I really appreciated my time on active service. I got off active duty in 2010 and did 2 things. I had to get a job. It was a tough time to get a job in 2010 because we were a year and a half, 2 years after the global financial crisis of 2008. And so a lot of companies were still cutting headcount. So it wasn't the easiest thing to get a job, but got a job working in Wall Street in New York City. And then I also helped found Stop Soldier Suicide with 2 of my ROTC classmates who were both active duty Army officers in 2010. And we've been growing that organization for the last 14 years now. I spent the 10 years on Wall Street at 2 different places, BNP Paribas and then later Goldman Sachs, and not only had a day job of being an investment analyst, but also working to help create some transition programs for getting other service members and veterans into finance, and still very passionate about doing that. And then I've created another business. It's a telemental health business, and have been working on building that for the last 4 or 5 years. So a lot of my career has been oriented around service, finding ways to continue to serve, and then also honing those skills of being an investor, an investment analyst, and entrepreneur. Really, how do you more effectively raise capital and then use that capital to design business models to ultimately, create value in a sustainable way?
Wow. Yeah, Brian, thanks for kind of laying out a little bit of everything that we're going to kind of talk about here today. Definitely does a good job with a spoiler alert about like what you're working on right now, and kind of that North Star of like what this whole conversation is going to kind of focus around, which is using the experiences that you've had in your life and the opportunities that you've had in your life, and being surrounded by phenomenal people, surrounded by soldiers, surrounded by people that are focused with values on service. When we talk about some of those values and some of those things that kind of drove you in the direction of Stop Soldier Suicide and helping folks so much every day. I mean, you just helped me for the hour before we got done. We even started here today, which is how can I help you, move forward in whatever it is you're trying to do, Matt. You're constantly doing that. You're constantly with those values. And so maybe you could kind of dig in a little bit onto what were some of those values? What are some of those things that kind of coming out of the service, coming out of those opportunities started driving you towards thinking about Stop Soldier Suicide in 2010, and that this was something that was not only necessary or not only important to take care of people, but this was a vehicle, this was a direction that you started saying, I don't know where I'm going to end up, but I know the direction I'm going. I know how I'm going to kind of start living my life every day.
Sure. And for me, it really started with the first unit I was a part of in Germany. 22 years old, just earned a commission, went to some of those basic schools that we all know that you first go through, but then you arrive at your unit with all this training, and it was okay. We have to train up and get ready to go on a deployment. And this was a platoon of about 25 predominantly men, but we had some women. It was a straight line transportation, like truck company. I'll never forget. Got a call from the platoon sergeant really early on a Saturday morning, and he was like, "Sir, we got to go to Landstuhl." And I said, "What? Why?" He said, "We got to go right now. One of the privates in the unit, she tried to kill herself last night, and it happened in the barracks. It was an unsuccessful attempt. She did not complete suicide, but she's in Landstuhl, and we're going to go see this soldier." I said, "Okay." So we drove out to Landstuhl. I'll never forget this young woman, 18 years of age, from Puerto Rico, right? Had never deployed before. She reminded me a lot of my younger sister, who was also 18 at the time. Looking into her eyes and talking to her, it was clear that this was someone who was just homesick, right? As many young people are, right? You're homesick. You're from Puerto Rico. You're now in Germany. You're in a predominantly male unit preparing to go on your first combat deployment, and I felt as a leader, we had failed. As a command team, we had failed, right? What could we have done better to pay attention to what this soldier's needs were? And that really stayed with me throughout, not just my entire time on active duty, but throughout my life, of really trying to pay attention and listen to, what's going on with people's lives, and then trying to find ways to help, not in a prescriptive way, but just in a way that, you may be connected to resources or be able to look at a problem in a way that they can't. And then how do you translate that into some kind of support? That person and I are still friends today. She's thriving. She did end up deploying to combat. She's a successfully transitioned veteran. She's a mother. She went to college, and just a real story of, how someone can go from a really dark time and ultimately pivot their life and be a happy, productive, member of our society. And, throughout my time on active duty, saw the attempts and completions of suicide in that force. And that really had a lot to do with, how do we come up with a sustainable solution to address this, not just for active duty Army soldiers, but ultimately service members of all branches, as well as the veteran community.
Brian, that gets us into the challenge that comes with stopping soldier suicide. And I know you, because you've shared them with me, there's many more just like that. As later on during your deployment, I have situations where when I was deployed, the day before we redeployed from a 15-month deployment, soldier killed himself in the guard tower with his saw. We had another soldier hang himself from a Connex with 550 cord. So not only did we lose soldiers to the enemy during that deployment, but we were losing soldiers on that deployment up until the last week, right before we redeployed, to suicide. And anybody that I believe that has served for more than a year or two has a story, understands what it's like for somebody to take their life or to attempt to take their life. You said, I felt like as leadership, we had failed. And so therefore that becomes the challenge. How do we as leaders not fail? Can you talk a little bit more about what the challenge is with suicide? What, from your perspective, from studying it for so long, what is the challenge? What is the challenge that leaders we're not seeing that's having us fail as leaders with this number consistently climbing?
A lot of it, in my opinion, there's a couple of different dynamics to the issue. Right. First and foremost, there are elements of the recruitment piece, right? Who in an all volunteer military, forget whether it's just the Army, it's really the entire military, right? Like, who is raising their right hand to volunteer to serve? And, where are those people coming from? What are their backgrounds? What are they predisposed to early on in life? Whether it's growing up in an inner city or growing up, in a working class, poor kind of setting, or coming from a great background, but what are those people exposed to early in their life? And then, how are those things compounded, whether their strengths, their weaknesses, their stressors, while they're on active duty or wearing the cloth of the nation in the reserves or National Guard? And then what is the transition process like when someone leaves, the umbrella of the Department of Defense and moves under the auspices and, of Department of Veterans Affairs. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about how do you go upstream to identify issues that come up in all of our lives, right? We all struggle with things, and then ultimately try to triage those things way upstream to ultimately course correct, someone going down a bad path. I always like the concept from back in land nav of all things. You got to get an azimuth check. And I always love to say, like, I'm going to speak to one of my friends and mentors and get an azimuth check. And people who are not in the military sometimes are like, what the hell is an azimuth check, right? But it's that concept in land nav, right? Like, if you're off a degree or two and you're only moving 100 meters or 300 meters, right? You might not be too far off the objective, but over the course of a couple kilometers, you're going to be way off, right? And so it's the same concept, I would argue, if someone's having issues, whether it's kind of at the family unit where there are stressors, where people are deployed and spending time away from their spouse and their kids, right? That builds up and that compounds over time, right? Or the concept of trying to transition from this family that is the military, right? And looking for that sense of passion and purpose as a civilian, right? No longer wearing that cloth of the nation and being around that close team that really becomes a family, and trying to find what that purpose of life really is, what they're passionate about. And sometimes it's really hard to go through, and then you compound other dynamics, like the use of substances coupled with frustration around the Veteran Health Administration and getting appointments, really trying to get into that next job and get established in a new community. There's no silver bullet, right? I think a lot of times when we speak to folks who are very senior in government or even in industry, well, what's the one answer here? And I think what we've found is that we can create a system that operates at scale to systematically address elements of this. But there's no one silver bullet. There's no one drug. There's no one type of therapy that can be applied writ large to ultimately get to the bottom of why we have over 6,000 veteran suicide deaths per year, why we've lost well north of 120,000 service members and veterans to suicide since 9/11, right? Those statistics are mind-blowing in terms of the order of magnitude relative to KIAs from those 20 years of war. And so it's complicated. And there's a lot of nuance to it, and be happy to share more about kind of how we're trying to actually execute that on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I love how you said nuance, right? I love how you said nuance, because the first rule of numbers is we can always make them say whatever we want, right? But the nuance, there's no silver bullet. There's no one panacea that's going to fix all of this. And I think in our day and age, with everything being so fast and everybody moving so fast and social media and everything, everybody wants the 15-minute, the 5-minute abs, like Brian, just give me the 5-minute, like, what is the one thing that I need to do as a leader, in order to solve this problem, in order to bring the number down. And you're like, there is no one answer. I can't give you one answer. What might be some of the things, though, that we can start with, that I could be doing as early as today? I love how you said, like, knowing where people came from, knowing why they joined the service in the first place. What did they grow up in? Did they join the service to get away from something? So did they already have some demons that are in the back there that they were running away from when they joined the service, when they became a part of your team, right? And getting to know people. What are some of those things that either you learned in the service that have now started to keep coming up over the last 14 years as you guys have started Stop Soldier Suicide, right? 14 years, that's a long time. So what are some of those things that you said, I was doing during the service, I'm still doing it for 14 years that we've been doing the most, that are having a little bit of effect as we move forward?
Awareness and outreach is one of the biggest, right? So having candid conversations about the issue of suicide, talking about mental health as a component piece of overall physical well-being, and that also crosses into kind of the emotional aspect of life. The fact that we do all struggle. Anybody who says, I've never struggled with anything, I would argue is just they're lying, right? They're not being open and vulnerable. But we all struggle with shit. And if we're open and transparent and genuine and authentic about that fact, right? That's already, one of the biggest hurdles, right, of actually someone raising their hand and saying, I need help with something. That's tough, right? And it's really tough in a military community where we are trying to create an environment of people who are highly equipped and well trained, and they're confident people in their skills and training. And sometimes that environment doesn't necessarily foster that. But it's been really great to even see senior leaders open up about their own challenges with mental health or substance abuse, or issues with deployments and transition and whatnot. So awareness and outreach is certainly a big key. I would also argue that, and I've always had this hypothesis, that being didactic and prescriptive is not going to really address the broader base of people who are struggling or open to getting help. But do you really want to sit with a PowerPoint presentation for 60 minutes and just talk at people about the issue of suicide? I'll never forget, it was, again, going back to that 15-month deployment. It was later on in the deployment too, when, our higher headquarters was like, hey, command team needs to present this anti-suicide training, give you the slides. And, it's like supposed to be like a 60-minute or 90-minute course, whatever it was. And we're up there as a command team trying to brief this. And it's like, what the fuck are we doing? Let's just have a conversation. The fact that we've been deployed and we've been going on missions every night with each other for the last year, right? There's clearly an issue that we all know about. We hear about it from other units. We were at Camp Liberty at the time, and we had a candid conversation about it. And the funniest thing was, afterwards, I'll never forget, the next time we went on a mission, we were in a truck in the middle of the night, and you just have a more candid conversation about I really am worried about going back to, in this case, I remember the soldier was from Germany, right? Because we had soldiers from Germany and Italy. And he was like, I'm really worried about this aspect of, what my wife has been doing, and our kids are really struggling, and I haven't been there, and I feel really guilty about it. I'm going to miss 2 birthdays, right? That was the really bad thing about those 15-monthers. And I was like, hey, as a leader, I know that there's actually resources that we can get you and your family connected to on that base, and we can probably alleviate some of those pressures. Oh, by the way, we don't have to wait till we redeploy to do that, right? And it was really the ability to kind of think creatively how to tap that family unit into those things. And that I'd say is the second piece, is really as we're listening and having those conversations and making it part of the discussion, allowing people to feel more vulnerable and ask for the help. And then the third piece is actually the execution of it. We can, whether it's running an organization like Stop Soldier Suicide, or a business like Rapport, or working at Goldman Sachs, or being in the Army, right? It always comes down to execution. How do we not just execute that tactically or operationally, but then strategically, big picture, right? How do we get this right at a systems level, such that not necessarily standardizing, some of this, but how do we make sure that that's part of the culture organizationally? And that, I would argue, is kind of the third piece of it that's really key.
Yeah. If I get this right, when you said under like the opportunities, you said number 1, awareness and outreach. Did I get number 2 correct when I say alleviate pressures? Or start making some progress, and then number 3 being the execution, the systems levels. Is that kind of how you bucketed those 3 things?
Yeah, that's right. Right, awareness and outreach, right, to make people feel more comfortable talking about things. Then the opportunity to really foster that at the smallest kind of level possible, right, where those dialogues are leading to, more structured discussions about stressors and potential issues, such that individual kind of leadership, the team level, family level, community level, whatever it is, start to make impact. And then third, like, how do we actually execute at scale to ultimately, again, try to attack this, over 6,000 people a year in the veteran service member veteran community who are killing themselves, and start to really get that number down. I mean, we have a pretty aggressive goal that we want to reduce the military and veteran suicide rate by 40% by the end of this decade. And that's an aggressive goal, but you need aggressive goals. You need lofty goals, big picture goals, to ultimately, I think, get everyone motivated. And then, in our case, right, we don't charge service members and veterans for any of the services we provide. It's all done at no cost. So we need to go raise capital from various buckets of money that exists out there to ultimately make sure that we can execute that goal. And so we have a pretty lofty goal of how we want to attack the problem.
I love the lofty goals, the BHAGs, right, if you will, the big audacious
exactly.
goals. And as a leader, and this could be a terrible way of kind of describing it, but I've taken things to extremes sometimes to get people's attention, and I've said things similar to, hey, imagine if you had one soldier that you were responsible for die of suicide, and when that happens, you will be either fired or kicked out of the Army forever. Like you were kicked out as an officer. Would you treat your day-to-day differently? Would you treat your soldiers differently? Would you execute throughout a daily basis differently if you were responsible for 30 soldiers and one of them dies of suicide? You will be out of the Army. We will remove you from your position. We'll put somebody else in, and you'll be out. If the answer is yes, I would do things differently, then my question will be, why are you not already doing that? Why are you not already living your life a certain way? And sometimes people would say, well, I can't be with them every single minute. I know you can't be with them every single minute. I can't help what demons they came into the military with. I know you can't help that. But do you know what they are? Are you at least attempting to know what these things are and know everybody and know what stressors they're going through? What about the soldier who just got in trouble for doing drugs, doing cocaine? What about the soldier who just got accused of sexual harassment, a sexual assault? What about the soldier in your charge who just got assaulted? Those are three people that are inside your platoon. Do you know the stressors that those are three totally different stress? Those are the people that potentially now we need to pay attention to because they have different types of stress. Would you be doing things differently? I would spend more time with those people. I would meet with those people immediately today and let them know that I'm here for them and that I care about them and that I'm here to help them get through it. All three of those were different situations, right? Like one's getting kicked out of the military for doing drugs. And so they're going to get some type of discharge other than an honorable discharge. So that person's going to go out into the world having a hard time getting a job, most likely going to become homeless, probably going to go back to using drugs when they leave the service. You're going to separate that person. The second one who was accused of this is definitely not going to be able to get a job, won't be able to get a job anywhere around children or anything like that when they leave the service. And the third person who was the victim, who's now got to get their life back together. Right? And so there's three totally different stressors that happen that we need to get on top of. So that's kind of the things that when I hear you talking about, the awareness and outreach, execution, and starting to make some progress, Brian, those are some of the things that I think of as a leader that come to my mind when you start talking about audacious goals for making a difference out there.
You bring up a good point and something that I've always struggled with the fine tuning of what's the right balance between personal accountability. But then on the other hand, the fact that there are times when people are struggling so much, that they might make a poor decision, and the system, being able to put their arms around that person to help them in that moment of struggle or crisis or whatever it is so very important, and especially important in the military and the veteran community. When you have less than 1% of the U.S. population serving on active duty at any given time, and about 21 million veterans in this country, it's still a very small subset of the population of people who decided to serve, I'm a huge believer that if we had more people in our society finding a way to serve, and it doesn't have to be the military, it could be Teach for America, Peace Corps, drive an ambulance as a volunteer, be a volunteer firefighter, whatever it is, If we had more people who were service oriented, you would probably have, I would argue, a stronger society. And so how does it get back to the military and veteran community? Well, it gets back to the military and veteran community because these are people who are raising their right hand again to volunteer to serve their country, wear the cloth of the nation. And maybe they made a bad decision and received an other than honorable discharge. I would argue we still owe it to them to find a way to help. And that's one of the things we do at Stop Soldier Suicide, right? We help clients regardless of their discharge status across all branches of service, all generations of service. There are definitely societal problems, that lead to things like homelessness of the veteran community. And then it's a question of how do we more effectively go out and find those people and bring them into service? Oh, by the way, are those people a good fit for our service model? And so, because again, while we are a nonprofit that's been around for 14 years, we still have a limited budget, right? We still have limited resources, and we're always trying to find the way to drive the biggest impact in the most capital efficient manner. And so, but I would argue, yeah, it's so important that we hold people personally accountable for their own actions. And then it's incumbent upon us as leaders, right, to try to figure out how to most effectively help those people. And then as a society, putting a big bear hug around the military and veteran community to make sure that these people have decided to try to serve the greater good are ultimately receiving the care and resources they need.
Brian, when we're still sitting in this bucket of opportunity, right, and what can we be doing, I want to go in a little bit of the direction of your experience in the military. Then you had your experience in the finance world, right? And now 14 years under your belt with Stop Soldier Suicide. And you see some of the pitfalls. You see some of the entrepreneurial things that you've learned over the years, understanding finance and understanding how these things work, right? One of the things I'm seeing, and a lot of folks are starting to talk about right now in the veteran community, is there are so many resources outside the military. There are so many, we got resources before you leave service. There's resources out there. There's a lot of different programs that are out there. And either the person who's leaving the service doesn't know where to start, or me as a leader doesn't know where to start when I start pointing them in the direction of how to get help, how to find this, our resources, who's the best fit. You said it, right? Who's the right fit for Stop Soldier Suicide, but who should be the right fit for other programs that are out there. Can you talk a little bit about what you've learned over the last 15 years, other programs that are out there, and what you're kind of seeing outside with all the people trying to help our service members as they transition out of the military?
Sure. So I would just break that down to two major buckets as kind of like what I've learned and how, and by the way, I don't know everything. I sure know a lot of what not to do, not necessarily what to do, but I'll share some thoughts on kind of that background and how that's made me a more resilient person, a more resilient leader, and a more resilient entrepreneur. And then, how we take some of these business finance concepts and apply them to Stop Soldier Suicide, which is a nonprofit that's run like a for-profit business that doesn't pay cash taxes, as a way to more effectively deliver the services that we provide. So my transition out of the Army into finance was not necessarily an easy one. I was one of those guys who took the GMAT on a combat deployment. I did terribly on it, right? The GMAT is a gating mechanism to go to an MBA program. And fine. It wasn't the most ideal testing condition to put up a good score. I'm sure many people have put up good scores on those deployments and then gone on to great business schools. I never actually went to business school for a full-time MBA. But when I was at Fort Knox, I did convince the general that I was the aide de camp to let me go to a part-time night MBA program at the University of Louisville. It was 6 months into this MBA program, and the earthquake in Haiti happened. And I got a note from my boss, the CG, that night. And she had just heard from General Helmick, who was the 18th Airborne Corps commander. Get ready to pack your shit. You guys are going to, we actually went to Southcom before we went to Haiti, had to leave the program. And I'll never forget getting back from that deployment and then trying to go back to University of Louisville and say, hey, I know I missed a couple months of the program, but I'm ready to restart. What do I need to catch up on? And they were like, yeah, no, you got to restart with another cohort. It's going to take some time to get you into the next program. I was like, well, that doesn't work for my timeline. And so I ended up leaving the MBA program. And it was at the same time that I actually decided to leave active duty. And one of the very senior professors who oversaw the MBA program at the University of Louisville, he told me, where do you think you're going to go to get a job? And I said, I'm going to New York City. I'm going to get a job in finance. And I already had rejection letters from General Electric and McKinsey and ExxonMobil. It was a tough time to get a job, but I told him I was going to go to New York and get a job in finance. And he said, you'll never get a job in New York City finance on Wall Street without an MBA. I was like, all right, I'm going to prove you wrong. And so, I ran a campaign, and I mean a real campaign, to send as many emails, hundreds of emails and hundreds of phone calls, right, to get that first interview, right, that second interview, that third interview. And eventually that resulted in a job on Wall Street. It was not the best job. It wasn't a great fit for me. I didn't know the first thing about financial services. The managing directors who ran the desk at BNP Paribas, there's a French bank, they said, if you don't pass the exams, you need to pass the securities licensing exams by the end of summer, you're going to lose your job. And to me, that was a huge wake-up call of like, oh shit, I'm in the real world, and there are no handouts here, and there are no free rides, and there's no real structure. And so, that's how I broke into Wall Street. And I ended up never going back and completing, an MBA or going to a full-time MBA program. And then a couple of years later, I got recruited to Goldman Sachs, which is one of the premier investment banks on Wall Street, for a pretty cool role to help build a business in a very prominent seat. And what I would share with you about the time in finance is really, again, this concept of becoming a more resilient person, understanding that you have to work really, really hard and no one's going to give you anything. But if you have the opportunity to be in those kind of seats and see the world from that lens and through that perspective, you could use that as a tool for good. After I got that first job in 2010 at BNP Paribas, had started with Nick Black and Craig Gridelli, the two co-founders of Stop Soldier Suicide, started the organization and really spent 8 years as a volunteer CEO. And by the way, CEO of a 3-person volunteer organization doesn't mean anything other than a title. But it was really taking those skills from finance as an investment analyst, as a business builder, and applying them to Stop Soldier Suicide. So that's kind of the first piece of it.
I'd love for you to go into the second piece, the first piece being like what you learned and your resilience and use your responsibility for good. What's the second part?
Well, the second part is what you alluded to, that there's over 40,000 veteran serving organizations in the country. And I think a lot of them are very well intentioned, but to your point, it creates a lot of confusion when someone goes on Google, they type in that search bar, I need help for X, Y, or Z, and a million different resources pop up. And then some of them are government sponsored, some of them are not. A lot of them are not these nonprofits. And if someone's struggling and they're in crisis and they've got an issue they're trying to deal with, they might just get turned off from the start of that journey, right? And so for us, what we try to do is really know what we do well and double down, triple down on that. At Stop Soldier Suicide, we connect at-risk veterans and service members to wellness coordinators, right, who provide very suicide-specific virtual care interventions, right, at no cost. And then we connect into this ecosystem of about 4,000 to 5,000 other partner organizations and resources to try to come up with a more tailored, bespoke approach for each person and what they're presenting with, to try to mitigate some of that confusion of where to go. That's something that we actually do from an execution standpoint day to day, of trying to get ahead of that. We also try to more effectively market or get in front of people who are struggling, because we know that they are Googling certain search terms, right? We know that they're potentially living in certain geographic areas in the country where there are higher density of service members and veterans that we know are in these high risk buckets, right, of people that have a higher likelihood of having issues. And then we'll actually go and try to market to them. And oh, by the way, Stop Soldier Suicide, while it's a name and a brand, right, that's potentially good for raising awareness and raising money, it's actually a big turnoff for people who are struggling, right? I still get calls from sisters, brothers, mothers, fathers of people who are like, my son, my brother, my sister, they're on active duty and they're stationed at Fort Polk, Louisiana. They're struggling with something, but I put Stop Soldier Suicide in front of them because I know you guys are a good organization that does good work. And they said, I'm not suicidal. So we actually created another brand called Roger that doesn't even look anything like Stop Soldier Suicide, as a way to more effectively bring people into our service model that's funded, by the Stop Soldier Suicide brand. So we're always constantly trying to improve, listen to our clients and their feedback, and get better. And then from just a pure business standpoint, like, yeah, if there's over 40,000 veteran serving organizations, there's probably a lot of wasted general and administrative kind of overhead that exists out there. And so from a pure efficiency of markets perspective or a finance perspective, like we got to do a better job of cleaning that up and policing that. And a lot of people say to me, well, why should I donate to Stop Soldier Suicide? Shouldn't the VA just be doing this? And we're not affiliated with DOD or the VA. We have received some funding from the VA around some very specific programs. Project Black Box, one of the most exciting things that we're working on. Happy to share more about that later in the conversation. But it's how do you actually take the investment of dollars that people are investing into your organization and then putting that fiduciary hat on to ensure that those resources and that capital is deployed in the most effective way possible. And I would argue that in a lot of these, not just veteran serving organizations, but nonprofits in general, while they're well intended, they're not necessarily the best arbiters and deployers of capital and resources.
I'm sure we have some imagination on when you say not the best use of some of those resources. You don't have to say it, I'll say it. And what I see is like in some of these cases, it's 80% of the funding is going towards salaries of some of the people that are working on the nonprofit. And I'm not a fan of that. I'm a fan of closer to 90% or 100% of the funding is going towards the resources and the people that need the help the most. That's what I think of when I hear the words nonprofit. That's what I think of when I donate my money or my services or my time. Can you talk a little bit about Roger and about how that just simply a different term is getting folks the services that they need?
Absolutely. I mean, it's one of those things where in business, you're always having to find ways to improve your business model, listening to customer feedback, listening to, this is not just nonprofit specific. I mean, this is just business writ large. And so what we did with Roger is we had to find an asymmetric way to get in front of people with a brand that reduces barriers to people who are reaching out and getting the suicide specific care they need. It's a much more inclusive brand for all branches. And it's really designed to reduce the negative associations in working with an organization with suicide in its name. We also, again, going back to this concept of trying to run a more effective business, right? We don't think of Stop Soldier Suicide, and I certainly don't think of Stop Soldier Suicide like a nonprofit. I think of it like a for-profit business that doesn't pay cash taxes. If we know that high-risk demographics are people who are ages 18 to 34 years old and those who are 35 to 45 years old, we need to find more effective ways to get in front of those folks. And, we do that by learning about what people are doing. And, that's really where Project Black Box comes in. We had this hypothesis years ago that if we could go way upstream by better understanding what people were doing before they killed themselves, right, we could do a more effective job of getting a brand like Roger in front of them to bring them into a support ecosystem where we could help them more effectively as people navigate, that myriad of all these resources that exist out there. And so, Project Black Box was really conceived and conceptualized by some folks from the JSOC and IC communities that would break into devices, right? So think of a cell phone or a tablet or a laptop, right? And then pull down all the information on that device, right? And do kind of SIGINT or signals intelligence analysis to find patterns, right? So we're not looking for one specific person and what they were doing. We're looking for hundreds and thousands of these devices, ingested into a data lake where we can more effectively leverage tools like AI and machine learning, which I think get bandied about, thrown about, in so many different ways in our society. But it's just more of an effective use of resources and capital to analyze that data at scale and then start to see that there are very clear trends of what people are text messaging, what they're browsing on the internet, what they're searching for, what they're posting on social media, what they're responding to on social media. And so we can already start to see very clear patterns, right, of what people are doing long before they have that suicide attempt or they've successfully completed a suicide. And we can then go and more effectively market to people who are in those age brackets I mentioned before who are exhibiting those signs of what they're browsing on the internet or what they're doing, on social media to get in front of them. And it's, again, like all of this, it's a double-edged sword, right? Because some people will say, oh, well, that's very Minority Report-ish. And, is that really safe? And is that really good? And we're like, well, if it's going to more effectively save lives, well, what's that investment worth? What's a life worth? And why would we not try to do it? No, by the way, I would argue if we get it right for service members and veterans with Project Black Box, that could be applied to other communities and demographics where we see high rates of suicide, construction industry, LGBT community, young women increasingly, young people increasingly are committing suicide. Probably a lot has to do with social media and benchmarking oneself to other people. There's a lot of broader societal trends that are going on, but I would argue these applications that we're honing and getting right in the veteran community can be applied to broader demographics of people that have very high incidence rates of suicide.
Yeah, just when you said that, I mean, I immediately think of people that work in the fire department and have to see terrible things, and pulling people out of burned buildings and bodies and seeing terrible things. Police officers who are having to deal with difficult things every single day, and then being spit on and discredited. Very similarly to Vietnam era veterans, and then our medical communities. I mean, there was a situation where somebody took their life, jumped off the building here in Tripler, not too long ago, a doctor, and that you maybe didn't see coming, but maybe you did. Maybe there were some of those signs and symptoms, like Project Black Box is getting after, that could have seen some of these things potentially coming. Can you talk about the phrase "market to"? When you say we got to market to these populations, and how do we get these resources in front of them? Because when people think marketing, they think Facebook, they think Instagram, they think you're marketing, a service or a product to me. What are you thinking when Stop Soldier Suicide says market to these people? How do you use that phrase?
Part of it is related to the concept of awareness and outreach, like we talked about. And so how do you make this part of the narrative? I would argue from the work at both Stop Soldier Suicide and then Rapport, the telemental health company that I helped co-found about 4 years ago, it's really about getting this mental health crisis in our country under control, talking about it, and then normalizing that, again, we all struggle. We all go through things where at some point we might need help. And there are people who are trained, right, as clinicians, as therapists, as psychiatrists, as psychologists, to best understand how to help people navigate some of those things they're struggling with, some of those stressors that we all have in life. The other part of it is related to then, again, in a very targeted way, pulling people into resources that exist that they might not even know exist when they're potentially struggling. So let's just think about, it's Friday night. Someone finished a week of hard work in our society, and they're a successfully transitioned veteran. Maybe they went through a divorce, and they're not necessarily able to spend as much time with their family and their kids, and they're drinking heavily on a Friday night. They're potentially in a situation where they have access to a firearm, right? We know that firearm suicide rates among veterans are very high, right? Over 70%. They have access to a lethal means of potentially ending their life, and they are drinking, and they're potentially frustrated with something that's going on in their life. And so how do we get in front of that person who's potentially, just cruising around the internet, looking at YouTube videos or whatnot, or playing video games, and really get in front of them with an ad for our resources? And it's not a Stop Soldier Suicide ad to raise awareness and outreach or raise money, but it's an ad for our services that Roger provides, where someone can say, you know what, I am actually struggling and I need some help, and this YouTube ad just popped up, and I'm actually going to reach out. And then, we on the back end better make sure that when that person reaches out, we've got the mechanisms in place to take that opportunity where someone raised their hand and said, I need support, and then actually support them with a program, right? A program that's been designed by professionals who understand how to most effectively deliver these resources and then help navigate kind of all the other things that exist, right? So we need, and oh, by the way, it better be data driven. It better be outcomes and results oriented, because it can't just be, well, we say we're going to do something and then we don't do it, really, really well. And we know from the data on the outcomes that we provide, and we have never lost an active client in 14 years of operating at Stop Soldier Suicide. We need to make sure constantly that we're most prepared to be able to execute on the mission. And oh, by the way, execute on the mission at scale. It's probably worth saying, though, again, we're not perfect, right? I mean, this is an organization that was grassroots, started with a couple of guys who wanted to address the problem. And, we're still constantly trying to get better. And we're still constantly, trying to get more resources to more effectively do this for a larger and larger and larger population of people that need the help.
Can you talk about rapport a little bit more, and about, is rapport an extension of Roger, an extension of the usage of, the things you get from Project Black Box?
It's an extension of the learnings of operating in mental health for so long and seeing just how screwed up our healthcare system is, how screwed up the fragmented service delivery of mental health care services are. Although it's completely unaffiliated, and it's a civilian telemental health company that was designed and conceptualized by myself and the former vice chairman of psychiatry at Columbia University, who built and ran a lot of the programs at Columbia, at New York Presbyterian, did a lot of work with the NYPD for their NYPD's mental health right after 9/11. But it's a civilian organization designed to most effectively deliver quality mental health care services that are affordable and accessible. So it was an extension of those learnings and part of my passion for really getting this mental health crisis in our country under control.
I definitely want to get, when this is over, like, I want to get those links, put those links to rapport, put the links to learning more about Roger, putting links to Stop Soldier Suicide into the show notes, so that people can, just like you said, how fast can I get access to, some of these resources so I can learn a little bit more. And so then we can start to, deliver on the back end. It's not just putting these ideas in people's head that this stuff exists, but it's quickly, as I loved how you explained marketing, it's how do you quickly see these things? Somebody's interested. They've listened to the entire episode now. Is there anything else as far as all the different projects that you guys got going forward that you've learned from, that you've got things in the works that you think, from an awareness and making people aware that these things exist, that you want to share with us right there?
Ultimately, it has to be executed at scale, right? I mean, if we're going to truly drive down the veteran suicide rate by 40% at the end of this decade, right? If we're going to think about attacking the increasing rates of suicide among young women in our society, right, potentially fueled by social media consumption, and other societal shifts, it's got to be done at scale. And if it's going to be done at scale, everything has to be modeled as an effectively run business that's sustainable with funding mechanisms that can come in behind it. I would argue that day to day, month to month, year to year, we need to take the data and the outcomes we're getting and really looking at what that data tells us about improving the service delivery of care, right? Looking across the continuum of care from start to finish, we've got to consistently learn and then apply those learnings. It's like anything we do in the military. You do an AAR after everything, or at least I imagine that's still a TTP the military uses. That's what business really is, right? It's what investing really is. You're constantly, taking a hypothesis, you have a desired outcome, you're making adjustments in real time, whether it's at the tactical level, the operational level, right, or the strategic level, that are going to mean you're running a more effective organization, you're running a more effective business. And that could be a business that's got 50 employees, 100 employees, or that's got 5,000 or 50,000 employees. That's how we think about it day to day. And oh, by the way, we're all passionate about getting to the root of this problem because we still get the phone calls probably every week, if not every other week, from someone we know that's reaching out with either someone in their community and their family unit, their extended, network of someone who's attempted or completed a suicide. And one of the things that we're finding is that we get further and further away from the global war on terror and fighting two wars, at the same time, that the problem is potentially compounding on the back end as those service members and veterans are transitioning from active duty status right after a 20-year career, a 30-year career, whatever it is, into the veteran community. Those issues they were able to mitigate day to day are potentially still there and getting worse. And so it's a problem that we have to really pay attention to, and it does affect every aspect of the veteran demographic, from tier one operators all the way down to those folks who were other than honorably discharged that are homeless and on the streets, right? So we have to figure out how to get in front of those different demographics of people, because we know that it affects everybody and it's not just affecting one specific group within the veteran community.
Brian, perfect segue into the last kind of two buckets of things that I wanted to talk about here today and have you share with folks. Is the first bucket being, how is all this, what you've talked about in this experience and what you're seeing outside the military and what you've laid out here for the last 45 minutes or so, how can leaders then start to apply that towards recruiting and retention and choosing the right people to be a part of our military, and then helping them retain them. And if they do choose to separate, make sure that they're the best contributing members of society when they leave the military, so that they're going out as advocates for these programs and for the things that we've been talking about, and not being necessarily the consumers of all of these resources when they get out, but instead being an advocate and building, these quality folks to go out into society and say, I did serve in the military, follow me, watch my example. I know how to be resilient. I know how to lead. I know how to deal with difficult times. Watch me. And I'm not necessarily a consumer, but instead I'm somebody to lead by example outside the military. Could you talk about that a little bit?
It's really a great question and a great point that you bring up, in that being vulnerable and being open about service is so very important for the strength of our military and the strength of our veteran community. For example, I love the Army. I didn't always love my time on day to day on active duty, but when I look back on it, right, I think back about the opportunity and the privilege to get to wear the uniform and to selflessly serve our country, at that snapshot of time, right? I got my second to last choice of branch. I never thought that I would be a transportation officer when I made the decision to join the ROTC program at Johns Hopkins. But, that was the concept of needs of the Army, right? At that time, it's what the Army needed. My first duty assignment was actually supposed to be in Italy at the 173rd, ended up going to a pure logistics unit instead. That was needless to say, changed the trajectory of my career. And again, it was probably antithetical to the type of military and Army experience that I would have. Ultimately, I still look back on the Army and my time in service very fondly. And I share that the positive experience of what that represented, the opportunity to lead soldiers on a deployment, the opportunity to be in Haiti right after the earthquake and work with, some of the most wild aspects of our government's apparatus and the different OGA types, and elements that exist to deploy rapidly and solve problems that need to be solved, oftentimes in asymmetric ways. And so, that was really a privilege. And I share a lot about that in my story, because, you never know going in what it's going to represent, but the opportunity to be able to serve, wake up on any given day and, be called upon to do a deployment, forget whether it's a combat deployment or a humanitarian aid disaster relief operation or training with other forces or responding to a natural disaster on our own soil, right? That's an opportunity and one that is very formidable in creating resilience through the rest of our lives. And so I think people sharing those stories and those positive experiences will ultimately help with recruitment. And then it's the concept that there's just a lot of different ways to serve, and it doesn't have to be in the military. We talked about it before, but the opportunity to, be a volunteer firefighter or do Teach for America for a year or Peace Corps or whatever it is, right? The concept of giving back, talking about how service and giving back creates a stronger society, I think really does change the way people in communities, whether that's community as the United States of America or community of New York City or community of people who live on an island in Hawaii, right, are able to then think about, okay, someone is struggling with something. Let me listen to what they're struggling with and why they're struggling. And then let me try to figure out a way that I can help. And that's a cultural shift that I would argue is increasingly important every day with the polarization that exists in our country. And that's one of the things that I strive for. And I think the military and veteran community really does a wonderful job of doing. And so it's sharing those stories and being an active member in community, even once we stop potentially, serving in an active duty capacity day to day.
Yeah. What you talked a lot of, you answered both of my questions kind of in the answer, which is what can leaders be doing today, to create that that experience for their people, to have a positive experience, to go out and share with folks when they leave the service or while they're still in the service. But you continue to have friends that are in the military. You still deal with lots of people in government, lots of people in the military. Just because you're on the civilian side doesn't mean that a majority of the people that you're talking to or dealing with are either veterans or currently serving, like myself. What's your advice as far as leaders like myself in the service or leaders in any capacity to create the best experience for the people that are currently either serving with them or operating with them on a daily basis?
My sense is that leaders who, again, not to overuse a phrase, but lead from the front, right, that are out with their people, training with their teams and their units, it creates relationships, and it flattens organizations in a way where people will ultimately then become more vulnerable and feel more comfortable with their willingness to, share things when they're struggling, and for leaders to also open up about their own struggles, things that they've had to navigate, challenges in their personal and professional lives, told in a very genuine and authentic way. Not a, hey, I'm up here on a stage and I'm talking again at you. I always like the concept of oak tree counseling. Look, we all fuck up with shit, but if you can have a regular conversation with someone, say like, hey, let's look at why you did that, why that's not good for unit cohesion and our ability to accomplish the mission. We need self-accountability, but we're not just going to hammer you with a 15-6, or some administrative kind of disciplinary action. Right. It's a balance. I get that it's a balance, but the ability to kind of talk to people through kind of what they're dealing with, and then using examples from one's own personal life can really create the kinds of environment and organizational cultures that strengthen all of those people organizationally. And then it allows that organization to more effectively and hopefully lethally, right, be able to accomplish what the military needs to do as a fighting force, and the premier fighting force in the world.
When you started talking about that, Brian, it made me think about Dave Pitt in episode number 9, where he said, getting to know your people, and people only remember the way you make them feel and the way you made them feel. And he used the words of, you're going to get to know your people. Either you might as well decide where you got to get to know them either in comfort or in crisis. And the time to get to know your folks is not during the time of crisis. The time when someone says, hey, I'm having a hard time, I've been having a hard time and I'm thinking about killing myself tonight. If the first question you ask is, where do you live? And how do I get to your house? It's too late. Like you're trying to get to know somebody during time of crisis instead of in comfort, which in comfort is tough training exercises at the range, during PT, after hours, getting to know them at lunchtime, sitting down with them. That's how you get to know people in comfort versus crisis.
That's very well said. I always think back to cleaning weapons, right? After an FTX or sticks lanes or whatever it was, what an opportunity just to shoot the shit and get to talk to somebody. Driving a truck on a mission in the middle of the night for 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours straight, whatever it is, right? You have the opportunity to really have someone open up about their personal life. And a lot of it is, again, the ability to ask questions, to thoughtfully kind of really want to get to know someone else, and then, have them share more and more about things that are ongoing, and then listening to kind of the nuance of where someone's potentially maybe not outright asking for help, but where as leaders, we have the opportunity to then, if we're hearing that from enough people in our organizations, well, then there's probably a trend of something that maybe at a more of a systems level, changes and adjustments can be made. But then also individually, okay, I know that there's a resource that we've got access to that potentially can help this person or their family, right? I think that there's a lot that we see that has to do with not just the individual, but the family unit, and the investment into that individual and their family is so very important. And it's one of the things that, as I speak to a lot of leaders, and some of who, some of the people I serve with are very senior now, they still struggle with the same kind of administrative crap that you're like, okay, this is part of the big bureaucracy of potentially serving when you have a military that's, got so many hundreds of thousands of people, right, that have to be, moved around and dealt with. But those senior people still struggle with that stuff, and they need help. And so I think big picture, it's how do we continue to improve the organizations of which we are a part to more effectively, solve those problems that we know are structural stressors and create more issues for people, especially those, that I always thought were, kind of the lower enlisted and their families, right, that may not have access to the same kind of resources, training, or life experience. Those things and those issues can compound, even more so because of that fact. It's incumbent upon us as leaders to really think about, things at a big picture and how we solve those problems, all the way down to the lowest common denominator.
If somebody found out later on that I knew that you were a part of the evacuation from Afghanistan, and we didn't at least talk about that for a couple of minutes, they would be disappointed to hear that we missed that opportunity. So can you tell me a little bit about how you got involved with the evacuation of Afghanistan, how quickly that evolved, and into you playing a huge role in that? And then what is the thing that you're going to tell your grandkids, years from now? What was the most memorable part about it? And what did you learn from it that you're going to take for the rest of your life?
I think, like many, that's something that I'm still processing, in that there's a lot of frustration. I was actually never an Afghanistan guy. I never served on the ground in Afghanistan, as much as I would have loved to have had that opportunity. But I know that there's a lot of folks who are still struggling with what that evacuation means and the unfortunate way that unfolded. What I would share is that, for me, I'm building a business. It's doubling in size every year, but even in some cases, it's doubling in size intra-year, right? It's a small business. This is rapport, right? There's a lot of headaches and problems being solved. And I got a phone call from Nick Black, who is one of the co-founders of Stop Soldier Suicide. He spent 27 months in Afghanistan with the 173rd, and he's one of my best friends in the world. We've known each other since the first day of ROTC at Johns Hopkins. He was a football player. I was a wrestler. And he called me up on a Sunday night, and he said, "Hey, I'm getting some guys together. I got a phone call from some people that are in the community. There's going to be a need to pull a lot of people out of Afghanistan, like-minded folks who worked on very specific programs and projects that we don't want to potentially be turned into super terrorists, or that we're going to be fighting in 4 or 5 years if we're back on the ground there. And he's like, would you want to help as part of that volunteer effort? And I said, Nick, I will follow you to the ends of the earth. Whatever you need, man, you let me know. When is it? He's like, it's tomorrow morning. I was like, tomorrow morning where? He's like, it's either Northern Virginia or Washington, D.C. And so I was like, all right, I guess I'm getting on the Acela first thing tomorrow morning, Monday morning, and we'll lash up and we'll figure out how we can contribute. And I appreciate what you said, but I mean, I was just a very, very, very small part of a huge multi-state, multi-country kind of effort with a lot of active service members, veterans, members from the IC and other government agencies. And so, went down. It actually reminded me a lot of the Haiti mission, in that you get down to a room with no windows, right? There's nothing in the room except some tables and chairs, and you got a bunch of people who are there. And I'll never forget, and I never met these people. I don't know who they are, but Nick is there, and some other gentleman named Brian Buland, who is a former Marine Corps officer who has helped us a lot with Stop Soldier Suicide. Just a bunch of like-minded men and women who want to volunteer to help the effort. And we didn't know what we didn't know. We had some information that was shared with us, but we had to spin up, at least in this JOC, Joint Operations Center, an operational mission within a couple hours to start figuring out how to pull very specific high-risk, like-minded Afghans out of country. And we set up this nerve center, and we knew that we had access to certain resources, in government, as well as adjacent to government, and some funding streams where we could, again, start to pull very specific high-risk, like-minded Afghans out of country with their families. And then we also started to get connected to a lot of the other amazing, incredible veteran-led organizations, and even non-veteran-led nonprofits and organizations that existed, that were trying to do similar things or other things, like, even if it was just to pull, one interpreter and his family out of country into neighboring countries. Our connectivity around that ecosystem, and our connections and our resources and our people that we had forward, both in Afghanistan and some other adjacent countries, allowed us to really help. My job in that was to help collate and prioritize specific individuals and their families relative to many others, right? There was probably about 180 to 200,000 high-risk Afghans that needed to get out of country, and their families. We were really focused on about 5,000 or so. So that was a little bit about my story. I mean, what I took away from what I saw with the Afghanistan withdrawal operation, and we were all volunteers, right? T-shirts, jeans in this room, and everyone was kind of check your ego at the door, check your rank title at the door. We're here as volunteers to help get this right in a moment of chaos, right? That I would argue, our government also created, but we had a very specific mission that we need to accomplish. And for me, there was that sense of frustration, right? Of how did we allow it to get like this? But that same sense of purpose, really, it was actually very motivating to see just how much people were going to come together to asymmetrically solve problems with limited resources in a moment of crisis on behalf of not just our country, but people that we fought alongside that needed our help. And we were damn sure we were going to accomplish that come hell or high water, and think creatively to do it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Before I go to land the plane, was there anything that you had hoped we had talked about in this conversation to share with folks about, whether it's Stop Soldier Suicide or Roger or the Black Box Project and Rapport, as we go forward, before I kind of definitely hand it over to you for kind of like your final word about what we talked about today.
The one thing that I just always am amazed by is how incredible service members, veterans, and their families are in terms of the capability set that they hone during their time in the military, and how that truly sets them up to be incredibly productive members of our society. It's one of those things where, going back to that concept of like a silver bullet or one size fits all, like there's just no one size fits all, unfortunately, for the transition process. After being off active duty for almost 15 years now, I've tried to help create a lot of programs and help a lot of individual people who have gone through the transition. And it is hard. I mean, I shared earlier my story of transition. It was really hard. But ultimately, I would argue additional resilience, personal accountability, and all those skills that I got from a problem solving, leadership team member perspective have made me very well positioned to be an asset for any organization or business that I've either tried to create or that I've been a part of. And I would just share, for anybody who's about to go through that process or is currently going through that process or has successfully navigated that process, there is a real incredible ecosystem of people who are out there that are willing to help, and being open and vulnerable and raising one's hand to say, I need help. There's a lot of folks out there who exist that will do so. And there's increasingly a lot of programs that exist, whether it's at big financial services firms or other major corporations, or even like, the Small Business Administration, right, to get loans for veterans and increasingly service disabled veterans. And so there's a real opportunity to, I think, tap into that network and that ecosystem. And I'm always happy to try to help, share my story and share resources and connectivity to help folks through the transition process.
I'm going to turn it over to you here in a second. I want you to have the last word here. But the thing I want to reiterate is that after this conversation, I appreciate the fact that you shared so much today. You shared so much beforehand, and that you're now part of the network of folks that are all with Teach Me to Fish podcast, and the people that are connecting. The Jaime Martinez that recently did an episode where he talked about his challenges, everything, all the things that Trivius is working on with his projects as well. Everything Sergeant Major Dave Pitt shared, to what our folks at Remy and Abby are working on up in the Army's Artificial Intelligence Center with data and artificial intelligence and machine learning, that this is all connected. This network is all connected, and it just keeps getting stronger as people come together and relationships start to get built and solidified, that we're all working together, that there is no one answer. We're not going to cover everything in just this episode or this podcast itself, but there's other podcasts out there that are doing phenomenal things for our veterans and for soldiers, and allowing people to learn constantly. And we're not trying to duplicate those things. Instead, we're trying to leverage them and tie them all together as we go into the future, that we are better as a network around the world, a network of soldiers, a network of veterans, a network of civilians that are all going in the same direction, similar to what you just said about the evacuation from Afghanistan, so that we get to know each other in times of comfort, so that when crisis hits, that network is established, that network is built, trust is built with these relationships. We know who we can rely on. And thank you for being one of those people that I can rely on, that I know is part of my close network, that I can go out and ask for advice from, both in a personal standpoint, but in a professional standpoint. And so thank you for what you've been doing with Stop Soldier Suicide, and with Rapport, the Black Box Project, and with Roger, and all of these different things, as we start to give people opportunities and start to synchronize some of these efforts as we move forward, and to do a little bit better. So thank you so much for your time today. Thank you so much for doing this, for volunteering to do this with me. And thank you for your friendship, and thank you for everything we're going to do, paying it forward, going into the future. So over to you, Brian, for closing words.
I just start by saying, thank you, Matt, for your service and your family's service to our country and all those people who every day, wake up and serve selflessly, whether they're wearing the cloth of the nation or not. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to have served and to continue to serve. I'd say with Stop Soldier Suicide, as someone who's been a volunteer with the organization since day one, and still a big donor of time and my own personal capital into it, we've got to run that organization like a business that is focused on lofty goals of accomplishing our mission to reduce the veteran suicide rate by 40%, by the end of the decade, and then even lower beyond that. And we've got to continue to adapt. We've got to continue to think creatively about solving the problems that we're presented with. And feedback is important. We're not perfect. No one ever is, right? We all struggle. We all go through stuff, but it's that resilience, that ability to consistently strive for improvement, and then the ability to kind of execute on those things that we lay out, whether they're goals, they're adjustments in our desired outcomes, and then that violence of action of accomplishing it, whatever it is that we want to do, whether that's a personal goal to improve physical and mental health, or something more lofty on behalf of a business or an organization. So thank you and anyone who listens for taking the time and helping to raise awareness and spread the outreach and their own personal stories, so that we create a more supportive society, not just in the veteran community, but writ large in our country.
Here's a sneak peek into our next episode.
And so, that little bit of adversity for me is just a reminder of it's not how you start, it's how you finish. And we all know that. It might take you 2 or 3 attempts, but it's about finish. What would a really good lieutenant do? What would a really good company commander do? What would a Ranger company commander do in this situation? And then you finally get to the point where you're like, that's me. Like, I'm just going to do what I think is right. I'm just going to be myself. I'm not going to try and be somebody else. The young leaders that are humble enough to admit that they don't have all the answers, they try and get 1% better every day, they're going to be just fine. And I would just encourage young leaders that are thinking about how they're going to carry themselves, just be yourself, because you're more effective if people know you're authentic and genuine.
Thanks for listening today. I hope we sparked some thoughts about the people that have inspired you to be who you are today. I hope you share some of your thoughts, and better yet, demonstrate them for the people in your life. Our pursuit is to get a little bit better every day. Progress equals small victories stacked on top of each other, building like compound interest. Keep stacking these positive habits like getting up early, working your butt off, learning something new, being positive, and surrounding yourself with phenomenal people. Please share your comments at the links in the show notes, and DM us at Teach Me to Fish podcast on Instagram or Facebook. Looking forward to our next conversation.
Times don't fly too high. Be sure to keep the ground in sight. Fly forever if you keep it tight. Love the world, but keep the sky on your mind.